In part 2 of the story The Finder, which is the first story in Ursula K's 5th Earthsea book, Tales from Earthsea, we're introduced to a wizard, Gelluk, who in certain respects is stereotypical and particularly for his time, and in other respects is a bit of an outlier, as we're going to see. He's described as looming above young Otter. Gelluk wore fantastic clothes, as many of his kind did in those days. A long robe of Lorbonnery silk, scarlet, embroidered in gold and black with runes and symbols, and a wide-brimmed, peak-crowned hat made him seem taller than a man could be. Otter did not need to see his clothes to know him. He knew the hand that had woven his bonds and cursed his knights. And then Gelluk says, I think I've found my little finder. He's being very, clever there. His voice was deep and soft like the notes of a viol. And we find out that his voice is sonorous and wheedling and one of his instruments that he uses. And who is this guy? So Gelluk is officially the wizard of the king who's laid claim to Havnor. He's not a real king. He's basically a slaver and a pirate, a warlord. His name is Losen. And Gelluk has, as we find out later on, an apprentice, Ursula, who will replace Gelluk after Gelluk comes to a bad end for, again, the king, Losen, who wants to use these wizards to do things for him, right? And Gelluk is in a particular area. He moves around from place to place. So he has to go see the king, and then he comes back to where Otter has been, after he's captured, been taken. And he's surrounded the entire area with spells. There's some very interesting descriptions about these, almost like vast networks. And they keep not only the prisoners, the other prisoners who are enslaved and working on things, stuck where they are, so if they tried to escape, bad things would happen to them, but it also keeps the young Otter, or Medra, who's going to become eventually a mage and who has magical talent, keeps him confined, keeps him unable to use his magic to, say, change himself into an otter and escape. And it turns out that these spells are so complete that Gelluk is actually unused to having other people talk to him unless he asks them questions. There's this very interesting scene. He pats Otter's shoulder. I know you have the gift of finding what's hidden, quite a great gift were it suitably trained. Have no fear, my son. I know why you led my servants only to the little load playing and delaying, but now that I've come, you serve me and have nothing to be afraid of, and there's no use trying to conceal anything from me. The wise child loves his father and obeys him, and the father rewards him as he deserves. He leaned very close, as he liked to do, and said gently, confidentially, I'm sure you can find the great lobe. And then the person who Otter is connected with, Anieb, one of the slaves working in the smelter, says, I know where it is. And then it's very interesting. Very few people ever spoke to Gelluk unless he compelled them to. The spells by which he silenced, weakened, and controlled all who approached him were so habitual to him that he gave them no thought. He was used to being listened to, but not to listening. Serene in his strength and obsessed with his ideas, he had no thought beyond them. He was not aware of Otter at all, except as a part of his plans, an extension of himself. Yes, yes, you will, he said, and smiled again. This is a person who has so much power compared to everybody else around him and has been exerting it so long that he can't see when other people are slipping the net. As a matter of fact, there's a point where that little boy is up to something, and he doesn't pay enough attention to it. What is Gelluk focused on? Well, he's obsessed with mercury, the element, the substance. And why? Well, he has found a book, and this book is going to give him something that he can develop, something that's going to set him apart from the other wizards. Here's a description. Of late, entering always deeper into the mysteries of a certain lore book brought back from the Isle of Way by one of Losen's raiders, Gelluk had become indifferent to most of the arts he had learned or had discovered for himself. The book convinced him that all of them were only shadows or hints of a greater mastery. As one true element controlled all substances, one true knowledge contained all others. Approaching ever closer to that mastery, he understood the crafts of wizards were as crude and false as Lozen's title and rule. When he was one with the true element, he would be the one true king. Alone among men would he speak the words of making and unmaking. He would have dragons for his dogs. And going on a little bit further in this, in the lore book From Way were passages concerning the true refiner's fire. Having long studied these, Gelluk knew that once he had enough of the pure metal, the next stage was to refine it yet further into the body of the moon. So it's not just mercury that he wants, it's mercury itself as a raw material to transform into this other magical substance, the body of the moon, which then he will be able to use, this purified Quicksilver, to become himself the all-king. And he's got an operation set there to mine and refine mercury from ore. The refining operation itself in the cooker is taking slaves who only last a year or two there at the most because of the fumes from the mercury and the ill treatment. Otherwise, Ania is one of those slaves, and Otter gets to see this and to connect with her telepathically, as it turns out. All of these slaves are busy making the heat that then refines the mercury from the ore, the cinnabar, into little tiny droplets, which is what Gelluk is after. And Medra is being used as a finder, something that Gelluk views as a base art, something he doesn't have to indulge in himself, but he can get this young man to do it. And what it means to be a finder in the case of the earth is being able to tell what's beneath you. So he can tell where there's water, he can tell where there's iron ore, and he can tell where there is the mercury ore, the cinnabar, or the red mother, as Gelluk is going to call it in his mystical way. So, Otter has found a small amount of it, barely worth refining, as Gelluk says. And he can also lead, if there is a mother lode, lead Gelluk to the mother lode, where then he can get enough of the mercury to do what he wants. So what's all this about mercury? What's going on here? This is being discussed in that lore book, but Gelluk himself is going beyond that considerably. And he tells, here we go, he's taking Otter into his confidence, and he says, "Do you know the king I'm talking about? Do you know his name?" Otter says, "The water metal. So the vulgar call it, or quicksilver, or water of weight. But those who serve him call him the king, the all-king, and the body of the moon. Those who have learned to see truly can see him as he is, the Lord of all substances. The root of power lies in him. Do you know what we call him in the secrecy of his palace? Would you like to know? I'll tell you." And so he says, his name is Turris. Do you know that name? It's a word in the language of the all-king, his own name in his own language. In our base tongue, we would say semen. For he is seed and fructifier, the seed and source of might and right. You'll see. Come along. You'll see the king flying among his subjects, right? So he's talking to Otter, and he's like letting him in on his enthusiasm, his passion. Mercury purified from the vile red mother. You can see a lot of misogyny built into this, or baked into this, you might say. And so Gelluk tells him that, here in the roasting pit, evil spirits that work for the king become clean. As they slaver, the dross and stains flow out of them. Illness and impurities fester and run free from their sores. When they're burned up at last, they can fly up into the courts of the king. Really what he's doing is he's just using up the slaves and killing them with mercury poisoning. But this is how Gelluk is explaining it to him. And then he tells us, Give your dross to the fire, it'll be transformed into the living silver, the light of the moon. Is it not a wonderful thing how from what is most base comes what is most noble? That is a great principle of the art. From the vile red mother is born the all-king. From the spittle of a dying slave is made the silver seed of power. So this is one of the key principles for him, that you get the best things from taking the worst things and refining them, operating on them in certain ways. And then there's this interesting little vignette where he talks about the difference between attitudes towards the mercury and towards power. He says to Otter, "Are you afraid of the king?" And Otter nods. And then Gelluk says, "If you share his power, he won't harm you. To fear a power, to fight a power is very dangerous. To love power and share it is the royal way." And then he says, "Look, watch what I do." He holds up a pouch in which he put the few drops of Quicksilver. He unseals it, lifts it to his lips, and drank its contents. He opened his smiling mouth so Otter could see the silver drops pooling on his tongue before he swallowed. Now, that's a dangerous thing to do, we know, right? In that time, perhaps people didn't quite understand that. And then he says this, "Now the king is in my body, the noble guest of my house. He won't make me slaver and vomit or cause sores on my body, for I don't fear him, but invite him. And so he enters my veins and arteries. No harm comes to me. My blood runs silver. I see things unknown to other men. I share the secrets of the king. And when he leaves me, he hides in the place of order and foulness itself. And yet in that vile place, he waits for me to come and take him up and cleanse him as he cleansed me, so that each time we grow purer together. I am the one who shits moonlight. You will not know another such. And more than that, the king enters into my seed. He is my semen. I am Turris, and he is me." And, so if Gelluk is actually right, he's not only refining it in the smelter, but he's also refining it within his own body and gradually preparing himself to become like the most powerful wizard or mage or sorcerer ever by embracing the power. As it stands, though, Otter recognizes that Gelluk isn't everything that he's maintaining himself to be. So here we go. In all the time he was with Gelluk, he tried to learn from him, tried to understand what the wizard was telling him. He was certain now that Gelluk's ideas, the teaching he so eagerly imparted, had nothing to do with his power, with any true power. Mining and refining were indeed great crafts with their own mysteries and masteries, but Gelluk seemed to know nothing of those arts. His talk of the All-King and the Red Mother was mere words, and not the right words. How did Otter know that? So here's a key instance, right? In all his flood of talk, the only word Gelluk had spoken in the old tongue, the language of which wizard spells are made, was the word Turris. He said it meant semen. Otter's own gift of magery had recognized that meaning was the true one. Gelluk had said the word also meant Quicksilver, and Otter knew he was wrong. His humble teachers had taught him all they knew, all the words they knew of the language of the making. Among them had been neither the name of semen nor the name of Quicksilver, but his lips parted, his tongue moved. Iazer, he said. His voice was the voice of the slave in the stone tower. It was she who knew the true name of Quicksilver and spoke it through him. So this gives Otter hope that maybe he can actually escape from Gelluk and take Ania, the slave, with him as well, save her, if she can be saved, from the damage that's being done to her body through her work in the refining operation. So what is Gelluk? He is indeed a very powerful wizard. He is also crazy. And he's gone way off the path, as even his apprentice, as we find later on in the story, recognizes. He's gone insane. And he's drawn to this idea of refining mercury as the key that will open up all power and dominion and knowledge for him, as somebody who's rivaling the beginning entity that created Earthsea, Segoy, the one who gave words to things and raise the islands up out of the deep. As it turns out, this is all nonsense. A very powerful wizard has gone deeply astray and is destroying many people in the process. Coming back to that thing from the lore book, what we find is that, here we go, there was always another meaning in the words of the lore. Perhaps the book was saying there must be sacrifice not only of base flesh but inferior spirit. The great fire in the tower should not burn dead bodies but living ones, living and conscious, purity from foulness, bliss from pain. It was all part of the great principle, perfectly clear once seen. And so he's thinking about what he's going to do to these slaves, a horrific death, a living death within the fire of the tower smelting mercury. So this is this character Gelluk, who we see come to a bad end and perhaps rejoice in the bad end that he comes to.